At the division of assets from my late husband, my son inherited the beach mansion and my daughter-in-law demanded the $21 million. I was left with an old suitcase she handed me while shoving me out. That's all you deserve. Useless old woman. When I opened the suitcase, my blood froze at what I saw. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. My name is Sharon, and at 63 years old, I never imagined my own son would throw me away like garbage. But that's exactly what happened on that cold Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks after my husband Robert's funeral. I sat in the mahogany-paneled office of Peterson and Associates, watching my life crumble piece by piece. The lawyer's voice droned on about assets and distributions, but all I could focus on was the satisfied smirk on my daughter-in-law Rose's perfectly painted lips. She sat there in her designer black dress, fingers drumming impatiently on her Chanel purse, while my son David avoided my eyes completely. The beach house in Malibu, valued at approximately $8.5 million, goes to David Michael Harrison, the lawyer announced. My heart clenched. That house held 42 years of memories, Robert proposing on that very beach, David's first steps on the sun-warmed deck, countless family barbecues where laughter echoed through the ocean breeze. David finally looked at me, but there was no warmth in his eyes. Just cold calculation. Thanks, Dad, he muttered, as if Robert were somehow still there to hear his hollow gratitude. The liquid assets, totaling $21 million, are to be distributed to, the lawyer paused, glancing nervously at Rose, the spouse of the primary beneficiary, as per the revised will. Rose's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. She actually licked her lips. Finally, she whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. My stomach dropped. $21 million to Rose? Not even to David, but directly to that manipulative woman who had systematically poisoned my relationship with my son over the past 8 years. What about Sharon? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. The lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mrs. Harrison, you are to receive. Let me see. He flipped through several pages, his discomfort growing more obvious. A suitcase. A vintage leather suitcase currently stored in the garage. The words hit me like a physical blow. 45 years of marriage, of supporting Robert through his business struggles, of raising David mostly alone while Robert traveled for work, of sacrificing my own dreams to build the family empire. And I get a suitcase. Rose couldn't contain her glee anymore. She let out a small laugh, quickly covering her mouth with her manicured hand. Oh my, she said with fake concern, that's unfortunate. David shifted in his seat, finally showing a flicker of something that might have been shame. But it disappeared as quickly as it came when Rose placed her hand on his arm. Mom, you understand, right? David said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he'd developed since marrying Rose. Dad probably figured you didn't need much. You've always been so simple. Content with little things. Simple. Content with little things. Is that what they thought of me? The woman who had scrimped and saved to put him through private school when Robert's business was struggling? The woman who had worked double shifts as a nurse to help pay for his college when the construction company hit a rough patch? I looked at my son, really looked at him. When had he become this stranger? When had his warm brown eyes turned so cold? When had my loving boy transformed into this entitled man who sat beside his calculating wife, dividing up his father's estate like vultures picking at a carcass? The suitcase is currently in the garage of the Malibu property, the lawyer continued, clearly wanting to end this uncomfortable meeting. Mrs. Harrison, you can collect it at your convenience. Rose stood up abruptly, smoothing down her dress. Actually, that won't be necessary. We can have it delivered. Her smile was razor-sharp. After all, we wouldn't want Sharon to make an unnecessary trip. The dismissal in her voice was unmistakable. I was no longer welcome in the house where I'd lived for over 20 years. The house where I'd nursed Robert through his final months, where I'd cooked countless meals and hosted endless dinner parties to help his business connections. David stood as well, avoiding my gaze. Rose is right, Mom. It's probably better this way. Fresh starts and all that. Fresh starts. He was erasing me from his life with the same casual indifference he might show toward deleting an old email. The lawyer handed me a business card. If you have any questions about the will, Mrs. Harrison, please don't hesitate to call. I took the card with trembling fingers. Questions? Oh, I had questions. Like how my husband could leave me with nothing but a suitcase. Like when my son had stopped loving me. Like how Rose had managed to manipulate them both so completely, but I didn't voice any of these thoughts. I just nodded and gathered my small purse, the same simple black handbag I'd carried for years. As I stood to leave, Rose's voice stopped me. Oh, Sharon, one more thing. Her tone was sickeningly sweet, like honey laced with poison. We'll need you to clear out any personal items from the house by this weekend. The interior designer is coming Monday to start renovations. My legs nearly gave out. Personal items. 42 years of memories reduced to personal items that needed to be cleared out for Rose's interior designer. David? I looked at my son one last time, hoping to see some trace of the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who used to beg me to read him just one more story. He finally met my eyes, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of the child I'd raised. But then Rose squeezed his arm, and his expression hardened again. Sorry, Mom. It's just business. Just business. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. I walked out of that office in a daze, the autumn air cutting through my thin coat like knives. The parking garage felt like a tomb, echoing my footsteps as I made my way to my old Honda Civic, a car that suddenly felt ancient compared to Rose's new Mercedes. As I sat in the driver's seat, my hands shaking too badly to start the engine, one thought kept repeating in my mind, Robert, how could you do this to me? How could you leave me with nothing? But even as I asked the question, a small part of me wondered if there was something I was missing. Robert had always been a strategic thinker, always 3 steps ahead in business. Could there be more to this suitcase than met the eye? The thought felt like grasping at straws, but it was the only thing keeping me from falling completely apart. As I finally started the car and drove away from the ruins of my old life. 3 days passed before I could bring myself to retrieve that suitcase. 3 days of living in my tiny studio apartment, staring at the walls and wondering how my life had collapsed so completely. The apartment was all I could afford on my small social security check, a far cry from the oceanfront mansion I'd called home for over 2 decades. Rose had the suitcase delivered by courier, as if even having me step foot on the property would contaminate her perfect new world. The delivery man looked embarrassed as he handed me the battered leather case, muttering something about strange instructions, before hurrying away. The suitcase sat on my small dining table for hours while I worked up the courage to open it. What cruel joke would I find inside? Old clothes Robert couldn't be bothered to donate? Broken trinkets that held no value to anyone but me? When I finally lifted the brass latches, my fingers trembled so badly I could barely work the mechanisms. The latches were old but well maintained, clicking open with a satisfying sound that reminded me of Robert's attention to detail. Everything he owned was always perfectly cared for. The lid opened with a soft creak, and I found myself staring at papers. Lots of papers, neatly organized in manila folders. My heart sank. Even in death, Robert was making me deal with his filing. But as I lifted the first folder, something caught my eye, my name written in Robert's careful handwriting across the tab. With shaking hands, I opened the folder. Inside was a deed. A property deed with my name on it as the sole owner. I blinked, certain I was misreading, but the words remained the same: Sharon Marie Harrison, sole proprietor of 317 Oak Street, downtown Los Angeles. 317 Oak Street. I knew that address. It was a small office building in the heart of the business district, the kind of property that commanded premium rent from law firms and accounting offices. But how could I own it? I'd never heard Robert mention buying property in my name. My hands moved faster now, grabbing the next folder. Another deed, this time for a strip mall in Santa Monica. Then another, a small apartment complex in Pasadena. With each document, my confusion deepened. Property after property, all bearing my name as owner, all dated from various years throughout our marriage. At the bottom of the suitcase, I found a thick envelope sealed with wax, Robert's old-fashioned way of marking something important. My name was written across it in his bold script, along with the words, "For my beloved Sharon, open only when you need strength." My heart pounded as I broke the seal and unfolded several pages of Robert's handwriting. The letter was dated just 6 months before his death. My dearest Sharon, it began, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I pray that David has not disappointed me as much as I fear he might. By now, you have likely discovered that the will reading did not go as you expected. I can only imagine the pain and confusion you must be feeling, but please, my love, read every word of this letter before you judge me. I sank into my chair, tears already blurring my vision. For the past 15 years, I have watched our son change. Rose's influence over him has been subtle but devastating, turning him against the values we raised him with. I've seen how she looks at our assets, how she calculates and plans. I've watched David become weak in the face of her manipulations, choosing the easy path of agreeing with her rather than standing up for what's right. My throat tightened. Robert had seen it, too. The slow poisoning of our son's character, the way Rose had systematically isolated me from my own family. I could not bear the thought of you being left vulnerable to their greed. So, over the years, I quietly transferred significant assets into your name alone. Every property deed in this suitcase represents years of careful planning, my love. I wanted to ensure that no matter what happened, you would be protected. My hand shook as I turned to the next page. The Oak Street building brings in $42,000 monthly in rent. The Santa Monica Strip Mall generates $38,000. The Pasadena apartments provide $27,000. There are 12 properties in total, Sharon. 12 properties that have been generating income in your name for years, managed by a discreet property management company that deposits the proceeds into an account I established for you. 12 properties. Generating over $100,000 monthly. I set the letter down, my head spinning. This couldn't be real. But the deeds didn't lie, and I recognized Robert's methodical handwriting on every document. I picked up the letter again, my hand steadying as understanding began to dawn. The management company is Henderson and Associates, their card is in the envelope. They have been instructed to contact you directly upon my death. The account information is also enclosed. I estimate the current balance should be somewhere around $2.8 million, as I instructed them to reinvest most of the income back into property improvements and additional purchases. $2.8 million. Sitting in an account I never knew existed. I laughed, actually laughed out loud in my empty apartment, the sound bordering on hysteria. I know you must be wondering why I allowed the charade of the will reading to proceed as it did. I needed to see for myself how far David had fallen under Rose's spell. I needed you to see it too. Sometimes the only way to reveal someone's true character is to give them exactly what they think they want. I wiped tears from my cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of relief, of vindication, of love for the man who had protected me even from beyond the grave. David will inherit the beach house, but it comes with a mortgage he doesn't know about. I refinanced it 3 years ago when I suspected what was coming. The $21 million Rose believes she's receiving? Most of it is tied up in investments. That will mature only if certain conditions are met, conditions that require treating you with respect and maintaining family unity. When those conditions aren't met, the funds revert to a trust with you as the sole beneficiary. My Robert. Always thinking 10 steps ahead, always protecting the people he loved. The final paragraph made me cry in earnest. My darling Sharon, you have been the foundation of everything good in my life. Your kindness, your strength, your unwavering loyalty. These qualities made you the perfect target for people like Rose who mistake goodness for weakness. But I have ensured that your goodness will be rewarded, not exploited. Live the life you deserve, surrounded by people who appreciate your beautiful heart. And remember, sometimes the greatest revenge is simply living well. I set the letter down and reached for my phone. Henderson and Associates answered on the second ring, and yes, they'd been waiting for my call. Yes, the account was real. Yes, the properties were mine. And yes, they'd been wondering when I'd finally contact them to discuss the substantial portfolio. I owned that as I hung up the phone. I walked to my small window and looked out at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, David and Rose were probably planning how to spend their inheritance, confident that they'd successfully discarded the inconvenient old woman who'd outlived her usefulness. They had no idea that the inconvenient old woman they'd thrown away was now wealthier than they were, but unlike them, I knew the real value wasn't in the money itself. It was in knowing that Robert had loved me enough to protect me, even when I couldn't protect myself. The Henderson and Associates office was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of some dingy back alley operation, I found myself in a sleek downtown high-rise, riding the elevator to the 32nd floor. My reflection in the polished steel doors showed a nervous woman in her best dress, the navy blue one I'd worn to church for the past 5 years, clutching a manila envelope containing Robert's letter and the property deeds. Margaret Henderson was a woman about my age with silver hair pulled into an elegant chignon and sharp blue eyes that seemed to assess everything at once. She stood to greet me as her secretary led me into a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "Mrs. Harrison," she said, extending a firm handshake. "I've been expecting your call for several weeks now. Please, sit down." Her office was warm and professional, with family photos scattered among legal certificates and awards. It felt like the kind of place where serious business was conducted by serious people, not the type of environment I'd ever imagined myself in. "I have to ask," I said, settling into the leather chair across from her desk, "is this real? The properties, the account, all of it?" Margaret smiled, and something in her expression reminded me of Robert when he was particularly pleased with a business deal. "It's very real, Mrs. Harrison. Your husband was one of our most meticulous clients. Every transaction was carefully planned and perfectly legal." She pulled out a thick file and opened it on her desk. "Let me walk you through your portfolio. You currently own 14 properties, not 12 as Robert's last letter indicated. He purchased 2 additional commercial buildings in the 6 months before his death. 14 properties. I tried to wrap my mind around the number, but it felt surreal. The total monthly income from all properties is currently $137,000, Margaret continued, consulting her notes. After management fees, maintenance, taxes, and other expenses, your net monthly income is approximately $94,000. $94,000. Every month. I made a small choking sound. The account balance, as of this morning, is $3.1 million. Your husband instructed us to be conservative with reinvestment, focusing on property improvements and mortgage payments rather than risky ventures. I stared at the numbers on the page she showed me, trying to process what this meant. 3 days ago, I'd been worried about paying my rent on a studio apartment. Now I was apparently wealthier than most people could ever dream of being. How is this possible? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I never signed anything. I never knew about any of this. Margaret's expression softened slightly. Your husband had power of attorney to make investments on your behalf, a common arrangement for married couples. Every purchase was made legally, with proper documentation. He was very careful to ensure everything would transfer to you seamlessly upon his death. She pulled out another folder. He also left specific instructions about the timing of disclosure. We were to wait until after the will reading, then give you 2 weeks to contact us. If you hadn't called by the end of this week, we were to reach out to you directly. 2 weeks. Robert had even predicted how long it would take me to work up the courage to open that suitcase. There's something else, Margaret said, her tone becoming more serious. Your husband suspected there might be complications with the official will reading. He left additional instructions about monitoring certain financial activities. My stomach tightened. What kind of complications? Margaret hesitated, then pulled out a thin file marked with David's name. We've been tracking the assets your son and daughter-in-law believe they inherited. The situation is concerning. She spread several documents across the desk. Bank statements, credit card bills, purchase receipts. In the 3 weeks since the will reading, they've spent approximately $400,000. New cars, jewelry, a deposit on a yacht, extensive renovations to the beach house, and what appears to be a very expensive shopping spree in Europe. I felt sick. $400,000 in 3 weeks. The problem, Margaret continued, is that most of the $21 million they think they have access to is actually tied up in investment accounts with very specific terms. Terms that your husband designed to protect the principal. What kind of terms? The investments can only be accessed gradually, and only if certain conditions are met. Conditions relating to family relationships and responsible financial behavior. Your husband was very specific about this. Margaret showed me another document, a complex trust agreement that I'd never seen before. If David fails to maintain a respectful relationship with you, or if either he or his spouse engages in what the trust defines as financially irresponsible behavior, the principal reverts to a backup beneficiary. Who's the backup beneficiary? Margaret smiled. You are, Mrs. Harrison. The entire $21 million will transfer to your control if the conditions aren't met. My head was spinning. Robert hadn't just protected me with the secret properties, he'd set up a trap for David and Rose, one they were walking into with their eyes wide shut. How much actual liquid cash do they have access to right now? I asked. Approximately $1.2 million. Which, given their current spending rate, will last them about 4 months. 4 months. Then what would happen when the money ran out and they couldn't access the investments? There's one more thing, Margaret said, pulling out a sealed envelope. Marked with my name. Your husband left this with instructions to give it to you only after explaining the financial situation. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a short note in Robert's handwriting. Sharon, by now you understand the trap I've set for David and Rose. They will soon realize that their inheritance is not what they believed it to be. When that happens, they will likely come to you seeking help, expecting you to rescue them as you always have. What you do then is entirely your choice. But remember, you are no longer the powerless woman they dismissed. You hold all the cards now. Use that power wisely. All my love, Robert. I folded the note carefully and put it in my purse. Outside Margaret's office windows, the city bustled with afternoon traffic, people hurrying to appointments and meetings. Unaware that my entire world had just shifted on its axis. What happens next? I asked. That depends on what you want to happen, Margaret replied. You could contact your son and daughter-in-law now, tell them about your situation, perhaps work out some kind of family reconciliation. I thought about Rose's cruel laughter in the lawyer's office, about David's cold dismissal of me as someone who was content with little things. Or, I prompted. Or you could wait. Let them discover the limitations of their inheritance on their own. See what choices they make when they realize the money isn't endless. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying my face. What kind of person do you want to be in this situation, Mrs. Harrison? It was a fair question. The old Sharon would have immediately called David, would have offered to help, would have tried to smooth over any family tension. The old Sharon would have prioritized keeping the peace over protecting herself, but sitting in that office, holding the proof of Robert's love and protection, I realized I didn't have to be the old Sharon anymore. I want to wait, I said quietly. I want to see what they do when they think no one is watching. Margaret nodded approvingly. I think that's very wise. And Mrs. Harrison? You should know that your husband was extremely proud of you. He spoke about you often during our meetings. Always with such love and respect. As I left the Henderson and Associates building, walking out into the late afternoon sunshine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: power. Not the cruel, manipulative kind that Rose wielded, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can take care of yourself. David and Rose had no idea what was coming. But I did, and for the first time since Robert's death, I was looking forward to tomorrow. 2 months passed, and I watched from a distance as my son's perfect world began to crumble. Margaret sent me monthly reports, as Robert had arranged, detailing every financial transaction David and Rose made. The numbers told a story of spectacular irresponsibility that would have been amusing if it weren't so predictable. The yacht deposit, $80,000 for a boat they couldn't afford to maintain. New cars, a BMW for David, a Mercedes for Rose, totaling $160,000. Rose's shopping sprees in Milan and Paris, another $70,000. The beach house renovations, which had somehow ballooned from a simple update to a complete architectural overhaul, $300,000 and counting. I'd moved out of my studio apartment into a comfortable 2-bedroom condo overlooking the harbor. Nothing ostentatious, I wasn't Rose, after all, but a place with room to breathe and a view that reminded me daily of how much my life had changed. The monthly rental income from my properties more than covered the mortgage, with plenty left over for the simple pleasures I'd denied myself for decades. Every morning, I sat on my small balcony with coffee and read Margaret's updates like a soap opera. David and Rose had no idea they were being monitored, no idea that their shopping receipts and bank statements were being carefully documented. They lived in blissful ignorance, spending money they thought was theirs forever. The first crack in their facade came during week 10. Margaret called me personally. Mrs. Harrison, we've received some interesting information. Your son contacted the investment firm managing the trust, demanding immediate access to more funds. When they explained the restrictions, he became quite agitated. I wasn't surprised. David had never been good at hearing the word no, especially not from people he considered beneath him. What did he say? According to the firm's notes, he claimed there must be some mistake, that his father had intended for him to have complete control over the inheritance. He threatened to sue them for withholding his money. I almost laughed. Robert had anticipated this exact scenario. The trust documents were ironclad, reviewed by 3 different law firms before Robert's death. David could sue all he wanted, he'd only waste more money on legal fees. There's more, Margaret continued. The renovation contractors at the beach house are demanding payment. Apparently, your son and daughter-in-law approved changes that doubled the original budget, assuming they could access more funds to cover the costs. The trap was tightening exactly as Robert had planned. David and Rose had committed to expenses they couldn't afford, based on money they couldn't access. How much liquid cash do they have left? Approximately $200,000. At their current spending rate, that gives them 6 to 8 weeks before they hit a wall. 6 to 8 weeks. I marked the date on my calendar and waited. During this time, I began to build something I'd never had before, a life that was truly mine. I joined a book club at the local library, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for when I was managing Robert's social schedule and David's crises. I started volunteering at a women's shelter, helping other women navigate difficult transitions in their lives. It was at the shelter that I met Linda, a woman about my age who'd recently left an abusive marriage after 30 years. Her story resonated with me in ways I hadn't expected. Not because Robert had been abusive, he'd been a good man who loved me deeply, but because I recognized the pattern of losing yourself in service to others, of becoming so focused on everyone else's needs that you forgot you had needs too. The hardest part, Linda told me over coffee after a particularly difficult support group session, isn't learning to be alone. It's learning that you matter. That your wants and needs are just as important as everyone else's. Her words stayed with me as I watched David's situation deteriorate. The old Sharon would have already swooped in to rescue him, would have found a way to solve his financial problems at her own expense. But this Sharon, the one who owned 14 properties and had millions in the bank, was learning that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people face the consequences of their own choices. Margaret called again during week 12. The contractors have filed a lien against the beach house. Your son is 3 weeks behind on payment, and they're threatening to stop work completely. He's been calling the investment firm daily, sometimes multiple times per day, demanding access to the trust funds. And Rose? According to our sources, she's been pressuring your son to sell some of the property to raise cash. She doesn't seem to understand that the house comes with significant debt that your husband arranged before his death. Of course she didn't understand. Rose had never bothered to learn about financial planning or debt management. She'd simply assumed that marrying David meant marrying into endless wealth. There's something else, Margaret said, her tone shifting. We've received reports that your daughter-in-law has been making inquiries about your current living situation. She's been asking neighbors at your old apartment building about your whereabouts. A chill ran down my spine. Why would she be looking for me? I think you know why, Mrs. Harrison. I did know. They were running out of money, and Rose was probably calculating whether I might be useful again. Whether the old Sharon might be willing to help if they approached me the right way. That evening, I called my old neighbor Mrs. Chen, who still lived in the building where I'd rented the studio apartment. "Oh, Sharon," she exclaimed. "That pretty young woman was here again yesterday, asking about you. She seemed very concerned, said she was worried about your welfare since she hadn't heard from you." Concerned about my welfare? The same woman who'd called me a useless old woman while pushing me out of my own home. What did you tell her? Just what you asked me to say, that you'd moved but hadn't left a forwarding address. She seemed quite disappointed. I thanked Mrs. Chen and hung up, then walked out to my balcony to think. The harbor stretched out before me, dotted with lights from boats and buildings. Somewhere out there, David and Rose were probably sitting in their over-renovated beach house, trying to figure out how to pay their bills. Part of me felt sorry for David. Despite everything, he was still my son, still the little boy who used to bring me dandelions and call them flowers fit for a queen. But that little boy had grown into a man who chose his manipulative wife over his devoted mother, who dismissed my 45 years of sacrifice as if they meant nothing. Robert's final letter had said the choice would be mine when David and Rose came looking for help. I was beginning to understand that this choice wasn't just about money, it was about what kind of person I wanted to be going forward. Did I want to be the woman who enabled bad behavior by constantly providing rescue? Or did I want to be the woman who loved people enough to let them learn from their mistakes? My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed David's number, the first time he'd called me since the will reading. I stared at the phone, my finger hovering over the answer button. Whatever he wanted to say to me after 3 months of silence, I knew it wouldn't be an apology. I let it go to voicemail. 5 minutes later, I played the message. "Mom, it's David. We need to talk. There are some complications with Dad's estate that I need your help understanding. Call me back as soon as you get this. It's important." Complications with the estate. Not "I miss you" or "I'm sorry for how I treated you." Just a problem he needed me to solve. I deleted the message and went to bed. Tomorrow, Margaret and I had an appointment to discuss the final phase of Robert's plan. The waiting was almost over. The confrontation came on a rainy Thursday afternoon in February, exactly 4 months and 3 days after the will reading. I was in my kitchen, making soup for the women's shelter, when my building's security called. "Mrs. Harrison, there's a David Harrison and Rose Harrison here to see you. Should I send them up?" My heart hammered against my ribs. After months of preparation, the moment had finally arrived. I looked around my comfortable condo, the harbor view, the quality furniture I'd finally been able to afford, the photos of my volunteer work at the shelter. This was my space now, my sanctuary. They had no right to invade it, but I was ready for them. "Send them up," I said. I turned off the soup, washed my hands, and took a deep breath. In the mirror by my front door, I saw a different woman than the one who'd been humiliated in that lawyer's office 4 months ago. This Sharon stood straighter, dressed better, and most importantly, she knew exactly what she was worth. The knock came 5 minutes later. I opened the door to find David shifting nervously in the hallway while Rose examined her manicured nails with calculated indifference. They both looked smaller somehow, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with the gray February light filtering through the hallway windows. "Mom," David said, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We need to talk." "Hello, David." "Rose." I stepped aside to let them in, noting how Rose's sharp eyes immediately began cataloging my furniture, my view, my obvious financial improvement. "Nice place," Rose said, her tone suggesting surprise that I could afford anything nicer than my old studio apartment. "Very cozy." They settled themselves on my sofa without invitation, David perching on the edge as if ready to flee, Rose lounging back with the entitled comfort of someone who believed herself welcome everywhere. "How have you been, Mom?" David asked, but his eyes kept darting around the room, taking inventory just like his wife. "I've been very well, thank you." I took the chair across from them, maintaining distance. "What brings you here after all this time?" Rose and David exchanged a look, some silent communication that excluded me, just like always. We've been having some issues with Dad's estate, David began, his voice taking on that patronizing tone. Again. There seemed to be some restrictions on the inheritance that nobody explained properly. What kind of restrictions? Rose leaned forward, her mask of politeness slipping slightly. The money is tied up in some ridiculous trust with impossible conditions. We can't access most of it. I see, I said calmly. And you think I can help with that somehow? Well, David cleared his throat, we thought maybe you'd heard something from Dad before he died. Something about his plans, or maybe he left you some documents that would explain things better. Documents. They thought I might have documents that could unlock their money. If they only knew about the suitcase full of property deeds sitting in my bedroom closet. I'm afraid not, I said. As you remember, I only inherited a suitcase with some old papers. Rose's eyes glittered. What kind of papers? Nothing important. Some old photos, a few letters. Nothing that would help with your situation. The disappointment on their faces was almost comical. They'd hoped I held the key to their financial problems, never imagining that I might hold something far more valuable. The thing is, Mom, David said, his desperation becoming more obvious, we're in a bit of a bind. The contractors want their money, and the investment firm won't release the funds. We thought maybe you could help us out temporarily. There. It was. The real reason for their visit. Help you how? Rose spoke up, her voice honey-sweet with manipulation. We know you're living more comfortably now, Sharon. This place must cost significantly more than your old apartment. If you have access to any resources, maybe we could work out some kind of family loan. A family loan? From the woman they'd dismissed as useless, whom they'd kicked out of her own home with nothing but a suitcase. What makes you think I have any resources? I asked. David gestured around the condo. Come on, Mom. This place, your clothes, you're obviously doing better than you were a few months ago. We're not asking for charity. We'd pay you back as soon as the trust issues are resolved. I studied my son's face, looking for any trace of genuine remorse, any acknowledgement of how they'd treated me. I found nothing but entitlement and calculation. How much do you need? I asked. Their relief was palpable. Rose actually smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from her all afternoon. 300,000 would cover the immediate contractors. And give us breathing room while we sort out the legal issues, David said quickly. $300,000, I repeated slowly. That's quite a lot of money. But it's temporary, Rose added. Once we get access to the full inheritance, we'll pay you back with interest. I stood up and walked to my kitchen, ostensibly to check on the soup but really to compose myself. $300,000. Not quite half of what I made in passive income every quarter. I could write them a check right now and barely notice the dent in my accounts, but that wasn't the point. I returned to the living room and sat back down. Before I consider any kind of loan, I need to understand something. Why should I help you? They both blinked, clearly not expecting the question. Because we're family, David said automatically. Are we? I asked quietly. Because 4 months ago, when you divided up your father's estate, you made it very clear that I wasn't really part of this family anymore. Rose's mask slipped completely. Oh, please. You got exactly what Robert intended for you to get. Don't blame us because he thought you were past needing much. Rose, David warned, but she was already in full attack mode. We didn't make you move out, Sharon. We simply needed the space. And frankly, it seems like you've done just fine for yourself. Her eyes swept the condo again, calculating and cold. Better than fine, actually. Which makes me wonder where exactly this money is coming from. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. She was suggesting I'd somehow cheated them, somehow hidden assets from Robert's estate. I smiled, a calm, peaceful smile that seemed to unnerve them both. You want to know where the money comes from? I asked. They both nodded eagerly. I walked to my bedroom and retrieved the manila folder containing photocopies of all my property deeds. When I returned to the living room, I spread the documents across my coffee table like playing cards. These are mine, I said simply. David picked up the first deed, frowning as he read. Oak Street Commercial Building, owner Sharon Harrison. His voice trailed off as understanding dawned. Rose grabbed another deed, then another, her face growing paler with each document. This can't be right. How do you own all of this? Your father transferred these properties to me over the years. Legally and completely. They've been generating rental income that I never knew about until after the will reading. The silence stretched between us, heavy with shock and dawning comprehension. How much? David asked, his voice barely a whisper. The properties generate approximately $94,000 per month in net income. I currently have over $3 million in accumulated rent payments that I was unaware of. Rose made a choking sound. David just stared at the deeds, scattered across my table. So when you ask me for a family loan, I continued, you're asking someone who makes more in a month than most people make in 2 years. Someone who has enough money to buy and sell you both several times over. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that I could practically see them recalculating everything they thought they knew about me. Why didn't you tell us? David finally asked. When would I have told you? During the will reading. When you were dividing up the assets like I wasn't even there? When Rose was calling me a useless old woman? When you told me it was just business and threw me out of my own home? Rose's face had gone from pale to red, her composure cracking completely. This isn't fair. Robert should have told us. We deserved to know. Deserved? I gathered up the property deeds carefully. What exactly did you deserve, Rose? You've been married to my son for 8 years. In that time, what have you contributed to this family besides manipulation and greed? How dare you? How dare I what? Tell the truth? Your father-in-law saw exactly who you were, Rose. He saw how you turned my son against me, how you calculated every interaction based on what you could gain from it. He protected me from you in the only way he knew how. David was staring at his hands, the weight of realization crushing down on him. Dad knew, he said quietly. He knew we would cut you out, and he planned for it. Yes, I said. He did. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Rose stood up abruptly. Fine, she said, her voice shaking with rage. Keep your money. We don't need your help anyway. But David didn't move. He sat on my sofa, looking smaller and more defeated than I'd ever seen him. Mom, he said quietly, I'm sorry. The words I'd waited 4 months to hear. But somehow, they felt hollow now, forced out by desperation rather than genuine remorse. Are you sorry because of how you treated me, David? Or are you sorry because you just discovered I have money? He couldn't answer. And that told me everything I needed to know. 1 year later, I stood in the garden of my new home, a modest but beautiful house in Santa Barbara with ocean views and enough space for the life I was finally living on my own terms. The morning sun filtered through the olive trees Robert and I had always talked about planting but never had time for. Now I had all the time in the world. Margaret Henderson sat at my patio table, reviewing the quarterly reports over coffee and homemade scones. My property portfolio had grown to 16 buildings, and the monthly income had increased to over $110,000. But more importantly, I'd learned to see money as a tool for freedom rather than a measure of worth. The trust conditions were officially triggered last month, Margaret said, setting down her coffee cup. Your son's financial irresponsibility and the documented breakdown in family relations mean the $21 million has now transferred to your accounts. I nodded calmly. I'd expected this for months. David and Rose had burned through their accessible funds by May, defaulting on the beach house mortgage by July. The house had been sold at auction in September, with the proceeds going to pay their debts. They'd been forced to move into a small apartment in the valley, their yacht repossessed, their fancy cars traded for something more practical. Have you heard from David recently? Margaret asked. He calls every few weeks, I said. Usually when he's hit another financial crisis. The pattern had become predictable. David would call, apologize for past behavior, and ask for help with rent or car payments or medical bills. Each time, I'd listen patiently and then gently decline. Not out of cruelty, but out of love, the kind of tough love that allows people to grow up. Even at 35, Rose had left him in October. The moment their money ran out completely, she'd filed for divorce and moved in with a wealthy widower she'd met at their country club. David had been devastated, but I'd seen it coming for months. Rose wasn't the type to stick around when the lifestyle disappeared. And how do you feel about that? Margaret asked. She'd become more than just my property manager over the past year. She'd become a friend, one of the few people who understood the complexity of my situation. Sad for him, I said honestly. But not guilty. Not anymore. That had been the hardest lesson to learn. For decades, I'd carried guilt for every problem David faced, every disappointment he endured. I'd been so afraid of failing him as a mother that I'd never allowed him to face real consequences for his actions. Robert's final gift hadn't just been financial security, it had been permission to stop enabling our son's worst impulses. The sound of car tires on gravel interrupted our conversation. I glanced toward the driveway and felt my stomach tighten. David's modest sedan was pulling up to my front gate. I should go, Margaret said, gathering her papers. No, stay, I said quietly. He needs to understand that I have a life now, people in it who matter to me. David looked tired as he walked up the garden path. He'd lost weight, and his hair was showing gray at the temples. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by jeans and a simple button-down shirt. But there was something different in his posture. Less arrogance, more humility. Hi, Mom, he said, stopping at the edge of the patio. I hope it's okay that I came by. Of course. Would you like some coffee? He nodded gratefully and took the chair I indicated, glancing politely at Margaret. Margaret Henderson, this is my son David. Margaret manages my properties. They shook hands, and I could see David processing this information. His mother had a property manager. His mother had multiple properties. His mother had built a life that didn't revolve around rescuing him. How are you doing? I asked, genuinely concerned despite everything. Better, actually, he said, and I was surprised to hear that he meant it. I got a job. Assistant manager at a construction company. It's not much, but it's honest work. That's wonderful, David. I wanted to thank you, he continued, his voice quiet but steady, for not bailing me out last year. I was angry at first, but I understand now why you didn't. I waited for the request that usually followed his visits. Instead, he pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. I know it's not much, but I wanted to start paying you back for some of the things you spent on me over the years. It's only $200, but I figure if I send you $200 every month, eventually I can cover at least part of what you sacrificed for my education. I stared at the envelope, speechless. David was trying to pay me back. Not asking for money, but offering it. You don't need to do that, I said softly. Yes, I do. His voice was firm. I spent 35 years taking from you without ever thinking about what it cost you. Rose made me see a lot of things clearly when she left, things I didn't want to face about myself. Margaret excused herself to walk around the garden, giving us privacy for this conversation that had been years in the making. I was a terrible son, David continued. I let Rose poison me against you, but the truth is, she couldn't have done it if I hadn't already been selfish enough to let her. I chose the easy path every time, letting you handle my problems, letting you sacrifice for my comfort, letting you be the bad guy when Rose wanted something. Tears pricked my eyes, but I stayed quiet. When the money ran out and Rose left, I realized something. You were the only person who ever loved me unconditionally. Even when I treated you terribly. Even when I threw you away like garbage, you never stopped being my mother. You just stopped enabling me to be a child. The envelope sat between us on the table, a symbol of something I'd never expected from my son, accountability. I don't know if you can ever forgive me, he said. But I want you to know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you raised me to be, not the man I became. I picked up the envelope and held it for a moment, then handed it back to him. Keep it, I said. Put it in a savings account. Start building something for yourself. But Mom, David, I don't need your money. I need you to learn to take care of yourself. That's the only thing you can give me that actually matters. He took the envelope back, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Can I ask you something? He said. Anything. Are you happy? Really happy, not just financially secure. I looked around my garden, at the home I'd chosen for myself, at the life I'd built with my own hands and my own choices. Margaret was examining my rose bushes, probably calculating whether they needed professional landscaping. My calendar was full of volunteer commitments, book club meetings, and lunch dates with friends I'd made at the shelter. Tomorrow I was driving up to San Francisco to visit Linda, who'd recently graduated from nursing school at 58. Yes, I said, and meant it completely. I'm happy. David smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in years. Good, he said. You deserve to be happy. After he left, Margaret and I finished our business meeting. As she was packing up her files, she paused. You know, Sharon, what you did took tremendous courage. Most people in your situation would have rescued him. I almost did, I admitted. Every time he called, every time he sounded desperate, I wanted to fix it for him. What stopped you? I thought about Robert's letter, about the trust he'd placed in me to make the right choices. But mostly, I thought about the woman I discovered I could be when I stopped defining myself by other people's needs. I realized that love isn't about protecting people from consequences, I said. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone fall, so they can learn to stand up on their own. That evening, I sat on my porch swing as the sun set over the Pacific. The ocean stretched endlessly before me, full of possibilities I was finally brave enough to explore. Next month, I was taking my first real vacation in 20 years, a photography tour of Ireland that I'd booked purely because it sounded interesting, not because anyone else needed me to do anything else. My phone rang, and Linda's name appeared on the screen. How did it go with David? She asked without preamble. We'd become close enough that she knew today had been significant. Better than expected, I said, filling her in on the conversation. I'm proud of you, Linda said when I finished. It would have been so easy to fall back into the old patterns. I'm proud of me too, I said, and realized it was true. For the first time in my life, I was genuinely proud of the choices I'd made. After we hung up, I stayed on the porch until the stars came out. Somewhere in the valley, David was probably in his small apartment, maybe looking at job listings or putting together a budget. Learning, finally, to be an adult. Somewhere in Beverly Hills, Rose was probably charming her new wealthy husband, already calculating how to position herself for maximum financial benefit when he died. And here in my garden by the sea, I was exactly where I belonged. Robert had protected me with his careful planning, but the real gift hadn't been the money or the properties. It had been the chance to discover who I was when I stopped being defined by everyone else's needs. I was Sharon Harrison. I was 64 years old. I owned 16 properties, had millions in the bank, and more importantly, I had learned that my worth wasn't measured by how much I gave away, but by how wisely I chose to live, and I was finally, completely, beautifully free.